So Nancy MacLean is a historian of the modern U.S. She is the William H. Chaffee, sorry Nancy, Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. Nancy's research focuses on political economy and social movements with particular attention to the U.S. South. Since publishing Democracy in Chains, she has toured the country and spoken many dozens of times, sounding the alarm about the plan and execution of the plot to shackle democracy in the United States. When I first read Democracy in Chains, and to this day, I consider her book to be the single most important book to understand how we got to today's political, economic, and climate and social situation. She gives a clear answer to the question, why are we as a nation divided? Without that understanding, it is difficult for us to understand how to end that division. In the new preface that updates the 2017 book, she writes, libertarian strategists have identified an alternative route to radical change. The route they have chosen aims to outwit us, to go around us, and few Americans have any idea this route exists, let alone how close it is to the final destination. Tonight, she will explain this alternative route to radical change and how the groundwork for it was laid over decades, but with accelerating force after a weak turnout from Democrats in the 2010 midterm election, which enabled the right to engage in the massive national gerrymandering project that operatives call Red Map. Following Nancy's talk and our conversation, we will take questions from the audience here in the sanctuary and on Zoom. Nancy, thank you again for being here and doing this.
It is very good to be with you and to see people live together in the sanctuary tonight. So I'm a historian by trade, and therefore my job is to explain change over time. And to do that, for our subject tonight, I want to ask you to just close your eyes for a moment and try to remember how you felt when Barack Obama won the presidency in November of 2008, and then during the inauguration in early 2009. Try to recall, and it doesn't really matter which party you were in. If you're at this meeting, I think you probably felt the same thing, a sense of possibility, of hope, of a country whose promise had been renewed, and of a world that seemed about to be set right. Now, I want you to also try to recall, if you can, the condition of that radicalized Republican Party in 2008 that had fought the election of President Obama with so much disinformation and bad faith. One Republican congressman said to his colleagues after the election, the New York Times reported, and I quote, "The Republican brand is in the trash can. If we were dog food, they'd take us off the shelf. If we were dog food, they'd take us off the shelf." So what happened? How did the right, and a much more radical version of it than existed then, indeed, as President Biden called it last fall in Philadelphia, a semi-fascist right in MAGA, how did this radicalized right achieve the power that is on display and has been over the last number of years? That was really the question that consumed me while I was researching and writing Democracy in Chains. And while there's no single answer, this one looms largest, that the right has had an organizational infrastructure built up over decades, the cravenly partisan Fox media machine, which journalists and communication scholars have shown actually promotes disinformation and a tribal consciousness among its devoted listenership, and also a willingness to say or do anything, not least to leverage racism and homophobia for political profit. And there's another puzzle that has no doubt troubled some of you as well. particularly the activists. How could progressives have won local campaigns on policy after policy and won majority backing on all of the key issues of our time, from climate and the environment to women's reproductive rights to living wages to supporting public education, majority backing on all of these things, but all the while lost so much power? How do we solve that paradox? What I learned from research into 60 years of development of the strategy deployed by the vast network of donors and organizations built up by Charles Koch and deployed so effectively from 2009 forward is that the progressive side had an Achilles heel. For too long, many of us neglected to work year in, year out in the states, and to do so in a way that built power to contest the rules of how elections were won and to protect democracy. Because thanks to the militant slaveholders from South Carolina and Georgia at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the states, rather than the nation, were given the power to decide how elections are conducted and by what rules. And the fact is, for too long since then, and particularly in recent years, progressives have been distracted, understandably, but still at a cost, by the bright and shiny objects, political leaders seeking power in Washington, D.C. We often say when we get together, people will ask, well, who do you think will be the next presidential candidate in this party or that, rather than the far more important question, which is, how can we build power where we live to set the agenda for whoever holds those national offices? I realize that many of you in this audience are heavily involved, and the 2018 midterms brought good news on this front, as did the 2020 election and the 2022 midterms, with plenty of democracy reform ballot initiatives and really unprecedented turnout for midterms. And after all, Trump's election had some unintended consequences for the right. It got millions of Americans to get more deeply engaged in the political process, including running for office and doing the kind of deep canvassing that led to what would have seemed impossible even 10, 20 years ago, to Georgia being represented by two progressive US senators, one African American and one Jewish. But I'm here to tell you that we've got a very long way to go, because the radical right has been strategizing an integrated and effective long game for decades now and building up the organizational infrastructure to carry that strategy forward. And it is very close to achieving an end game few of you have likely heard about. After all, why is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, now a veritable synonym for the Koch network? And by the way, ALEC is celebrating its 50th anniversary this October 4th. And what explains the right's vast investments in more than 150 affiliates of something called the State Policy Network? That network's affiliates operate not just in places like my state of North Carolina, Florida, Texas, and Tennessee, but also in Wisconsin, Ohio, and Maine. And in your state of Massachusetts, you have the Pioneer Institute and the Beacon Hill Institute. And in fact, these State Policy Network affiliates operate throughout the nation to set the agenda for state legislatures. The reality is that the right had a strategy that depended on taking power in the states, which they did after the 2010 midterms with a vengeance, getting control over a majority of states so that they could impose their agenda from Wisconsin to North Carolina and across all the states of the former Confederacy and many in the Midwest and West. And in those states, these new radical legislative majorities inflicted a radical policy agenda that changed the nation too, and so took the air from those high hopes of 2008. Koch Industries' top government and public affairs operative gloated about this at a 2015 donor summit. He said, "We're close to winning." And then he went on, they, meaning critics of the Koch network, people trying to move progressive agendas, he said, they don't have the real path. So what is that real path? I believe I found it in my research. And in fact, it's right there in the State Policy Network slogan, which is transforming the nation one state at a time. And it's not subtle. Step 1, gain control of an ever-growing number of states, now 30. Step 2, alter the rules of the political game in each state after capturing power. I probably don't need to remind you of the kinds of things they did in states like North Carolina. Radical and racist redistricting with incredibly sophisticated technology that also, as one shock judge said in a North Carolina case, targeted Black voters with, as he put it, almost surgical precision. Hamstringing labor unions, especially teachers' unions and other public sector unions. Undermining of Planned Parenthood, another powerful progressive lobby, by cutting off federal grants. Voter suppression, the likes of which we have not seen in this country since the so-called Redeemers, white former Confederates, stole Black men's voting rights at the turn of the 20th century. And by the way, they've also targeted young voters, although too many mistakenly believe that that is not a violation of the Constitution. I could say more about that in the discussion if anyone's interested. Additionally, they lifted restrictions on dark money in state politics. They privatized public resources to weaken the people's collective power and engorge their corporate partners with newly turned over things like school monies. They used litigation by red states' attorneys general against the Affordable Care Act, measures to stop climate breakdown, and much more. And they preempted local progressive victories, from living wages to anti-discrimination ordinances to environmental protections. They even preempted the mandates in cities, in blue cities, to wear masks to stop COVID transmission. They stopped those at the state level. And they attempted to rig state courts and rob Democratic governors of long-established powers. That list could go on and on. Together, though, what it amounts to is massive rule rigging to get what they know they cannot get by honest persuasion. Instead, they stacked the deck and dealt their own hands. Now, these are shrewd people we're talking about. So winning power at the state level, they know, is cheaper than contesting for office in Washington, for one thing. So there's a high return on these state investments. Also, though, state legislatures are strategic because they make the rules on voting eligibility, on how elections are conducted, and of course, redistricting every 10 years with the census. As well, those of you who are engaged in state politics know that states control crucial matters of our everyday lives, sometimes, much more important to our daily lives than the national government, things like education, criminal justice, and much more. If you want a government to fail, and the radical corporate libertarian right does want government to fail, making it fail in a state isn't so hard. I'm seeing it in my own state. And that delegitimizes government, leaving only the market, by which we should say what we really mean is corporations, leaving only corporations to address our problems, and leaving spreading despair that leads to something else that is especially helpful to these plans on the right. That is disengagement and cynicism among the citizenry. It's a strategy that's based on something that every ultra-rich right-wing donor and libertarian strategic thinker knows in their bones. Because they represent such a tiny minority, because their views are unpopular, they must disinform the public and they must rig the game in their favor. In their minds, it's even a righteous approach, protecting, as they think of it, the makers, meaning themselves, from the takers, which they think of as the rest of us, or as they sometimes put it, the job creators from the predators. And they've capitalized on how geographic representation leaves less populated states and rural counties, gives them disproportionate power. Some of you may have heard of Grover Norquist, an extremely strategic long-term Koch grantee who heads the group Americans for Tax Reform. He has actually equated the right's chokehold on so many states with a Roman pilum. Now, probably you don't know what a pilum is. I didn't. I had to look it up, and I had to look at images to try to understand what he was getting at with that metaphor. A pilum is a spear powerful enough to penetrate any shield and barbed. So in Norquist's words, it could not be pulled out. That's what they were aiming for with the control of the majority of state legislatures and the rewriting of the rules in those states. So what is the end game of this carefully wrought, interconnected strategy that relies so much on acquiring and holding power at the state level? Knowing that the number of people who want the libertarian dream world brought into being is tiny, the strategists identified an alternative route to radical change. And that route is basically to go around us and go through the back door to changing the Constitution. And few Americans know that this route exists, let alone how close it is to the final destination. In the conclusion of the original edition of Democracy in Chains, I explained that, quote, the ultimate target of the well-heeled right's stealth plan was the Constitution. Only through what James McGill Buchanan, the Tennessee-born Nobel Prize-winning economist whose story is at the heart of the book, what he called constitutional revolution, only through such constitutional revolution, he and others began to realize could the libertarian vision of a shackled national government be achieved. In the preface to the new edition, with so many years of experience to reflect on, I say much more about this. The constitutional revolution that Buchanan urged was much more than a new amendment. And since his death, it has become an effort to open the door to an entire rewrite of our Constitution. And to start the process, again, by entering through the back door, not the front. To understand what's underway, though, we need to revisit Article 5. And I don't know if you have these handy pocket constitutions as I do from the American Civil Liberties Union, but you'll see that Article 5 is extremely brief, basically a long paragraph. And it's the paragraph in the Constitution devoted to defining the rules for amendments to the Constitution. It specifies two routes to amendment. One route goes through Congress with a great deal of deliberation and sunshine. And all 27 amendments have followed this congressional route. In fact, most of those amendments are what some constitutional scholars call the People's Constitution. They're actually longer now than the original Constitution, and they reflect the growing inclusiveness of democracy and the agenda that popular majorities have set. But that congressional route is not the only route to amending the Constitution that is contained in Article 5. The second approach, which has never been tried, the second approach to amendments cuts Congress out of the deliberations. It gives state legislatures the right to call for holding a new constitutional convention. All that's required is for 2/3 of them to file applications for such a convention. Congress would then be obliged to call the convention. So what might happen if such a constitutional convention were to be convened today? I think you probably realize, even just giving it a moment's reflection, the answer is unimaginable harm, because the right wing will be in control, and the framers did not put any guardrails on this process. Warren Burger, the conservative Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1969 to 1986, noted that, and I quote, "There is no way to effectively limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. No way to effectively limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention." The Koch network understands this. So do the Christian nationalist activists of MAGA, formerly the Tea Party. In fact, they're counting on it. After Mitt Romney surprised the right by his defeat in the 2012 presidential election, a group of ultra-wealthy donors and the operatives they fund on the radical right launched a quiet new campaign. They had already used their wealth and savvy institution building, as I described, to capture a majority of state legislatures in 2010. So the groundwork was in place for this new phase. The new campaign was spearheaded, again, by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Its member legislators in each state were given detailed instructions as well as model text to bring back to their state houses in 2013 for resolutions to authorize an Article 5 constitutional convention. And as I speak with you tonight, 28 of the 34 states needed to reach 2/3 have passed such enabling legislation. And convention backers have held 3 simulations in colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, 3 simulated constitutional conventions. If this kind of constitutional convention were convened, you might ask, what exactly is it that the ultra-rich backers want? Well, we don't have to guess. Their chosen so-called grassroots leaders mince no words when they're speaking to friendly audiences. Mark Meckler, the leader of the Convention of States campaign, which is backing the ALEC-allied state legislators with communications, organizing, and concerted lobbying, again, including in my state of North Carolina, has said the purpose is, and I quote, to reverse 115 years of progressivism. To reverse 115 years of progressivism. So in other words, this right is not aiming solely at what was achieved by the movements of the 60s, things from civil rights to women's rights to environmental protection, nor are they only taking aim at the New Deal, at Social Security, workers' rights, and so forth. They actually want to go back to the progressive era and repeal, essentially, make impossible things like corporate regulation, progressive income taxes, and more. The likelihood of anything representing the will of the majority coming out of this kind of convention is, needless to say, virtually nil. But nevertheless, should enough state legislatures sign on to invoke Article 5, there's actually nothing the rest of us can do to stop the process from going forward. And Mark Meckler and the other convention advocates actually boast about this, that there's nothing the president can do, nothing Congress can do, nothing the Supreme Court can do if they get the requisite number of states. And here's the bombshell that makes alerting people to this effort all the more urgent. The leaders of this convention push have realized that the last 6 states needed are going to be too hard to win over honestly. As Democrats have tried to correct our pre-2010 folly of failing to organize at the state level, the Republican grip on some purple states is slipping. And state houses that change hands can be expected to rescind their Article 5 authorizations, as a few have already done. But does that mean the advocates will accept the defeat of their plan through the normal working of democracy? No. These are true believers who will not give up. And they have convinced their grassroots army, as they refer to it, with prodding from Fox hosts like Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, and many, many others that you can see on the Convention of States website, that today's multiracial, gender-inclusive majority is a mortal threat to the America of their imaginations. So an ends justify any means strategy is needed. Now, among the many weaknesses of Article 5, it does not set any time limit on the proposal process. So the strategists behind this effort have decided that there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents them from, in their new favorite verb, aggregating all the authorizations ever passed by state legislatures for any purpose and left on the books with open-ended, unrestricted language, even though many of them were wholly unrelated to the current push for a convention. To give you a sense of how serious this is, in the most shameless power grab, they include in their count New York's 1789 application, which sought a convention to ensure that a Bill of Rights was added to the constitutions. So with this kind of crooked accounting, the organizers claim they now have all the authorizations needed, and they're ready to demand that Congress grant their demand that preparations must begin. And this they will do if they gain control of both houses of Congress in 2024. So the coming election is about so much more than Trump and MAGA. It is about the operating rules that our society will follow for the indeterminate future. Will the right succeed in this audacious plan? We can't know in advance, because the answer depends on the American people, on people like us. Many have recognized the all-hands-on-deck emergency our democracy faces, and this was shown by the turnout in competitive states in November 2022, which won us a temporary reprieve. Pundits assumed that that couldn't happen because they used predictive models based on normal times, when these times are anything but normal. Recognizing the mortal threat from the former president and his MAGA movement and a Supreme Court that has been captured by the Federalist Society, pro-democracy voters turned out in unprecedented numbers in the midterm elections of 2018 and the general election of 2020. And in 2022, enough of us saw ongoing menace from the authoritarians, who very openly planned to overturn elections their party lost, that the widely predicted red wave failed to materialize in states with competitive national races. Across the spectrum of progressive and mainstream activism, in fact, people are rowing together as they have not for generations, including women's groups, unions, civil rights organizations, environmentalists, youth, civic groups, mainline faith congregations, new multiracial get out the vote efforts, and more. So can we inform and activate enough voters to reclaim power in enough states before November 2024 to defeat the fossil fuel multi-billionaires, the Christian nationalists, and the white power activists who refuse to accept losing at the ballot box and now want to rewrite our Constitution? This is the prime question of our time, and our action or inaction will help answer it. Thank you.